Before I introduce or take over the microphone to our faith-based, Indiana-based, relationship-based group, the Sisters of Providence have had a long history of speaking out against injustice, against all kinds of threats to human dignity. And I just wanted to remind us all that this past July, we reiterated our statement against capital punishment. And we said that as we said in the statement, we believe in the sacredness and dignity of all life. We believe we're to love our neighbor and not to kill. Additionally, we believe we need to face the injustice within our criminal, supposedly justice system. That it's fatally flawed, deep flaws within the system. And that's another reason why we stand up here, why I'm standing up here, why we as a congregation continue to speak out to say we need reasonable voices and reasonable conversation around the racism within the justice system, around the unequal application of penalties within the criminal justice system. There are so many things we could point out. But let me say before I give over the mic, for some of us, right now we're celebrating a season called Advent. Some are looking towards the celebration of Hanukkah. Some have other rituals and cultural and religious celebrations that I won't be able to name them all. But one of the things that I think could be a common thread for all of us is about light and darkness. And by standing up here today, by coming up here to share some words, I believe we're adding some more light into this world. Seeking the light, being the light, by our actions and in our speech, we proclaim that no one is beyond God's love. No one. We are all able to be redeemed, forgiven, brought back. So that's what I'm going to say. And then we're going to start with, I don't know if you all among yourselves decided who's going first or no? Ashley, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So my name is Ashley Kincaid Eve, and I am just a death penalty activist, and I'm also a public defender. I actually went to law school because of my experiences with the death penalty and the stories that I've heard with the people in this movement and the people that have inspired me. I got involved in this movement about 12 years ago, but really my experience with the death penalty starts a long time ago with a memory that I have of the first federal execution carried out in the modern death penalty era. And that was an execution of Timothy McVeigh. I was just 13 years old when Timothy McVeigh was executed. And I remember very clearly because I grew up in Avon, Indiana, which is just an hour away from here. And as a child, there was no escaping the news leading up to the execution. And yet, the night before the execution, I remember vividly, I was driving with my father, and we were driving south over a bridge, and he pointed at the sun. And I remember it was sunset, and the sun was such a magnificent, beautiful, red, fiery ball of light. And he pointed and he goes, "Hey, Pooh, what's that?" And he always called me Pooh, and he liked to tease me a lot. He liked to distract me so I'd look at something so he could tickle me. And assuming he was just trying to do that, I was like, "I don't know, Dad, the sun." And he points at it, and he just goes, "That's Timothy McVeigh's last sunset." And he threw his head back in laughter and just cackled. And I describe that moment today as my first empathic experience. Because as a 13-year-old girl in that moment, I was instantly transported inside of Timothy McVeigh's cell. And as I was looking at that sun, taking in every single bit of its glory and every single bit of its warmth and brightness, I imagined what it would feel like to be sitting there looking out of a window, knowing that that sunset would be the last sunset I would ever see. Knowing that once its lights were gone and had set fully, that the next time I saw the beautiful light of the sun would be on the morning of my own execution. And I knew very much what Timothy McVeigh had done. It was impossible to escape the news of the horrendous crimes he did and the hundreds of lives that were forever changed by his tragic actions. But yet, in that moment, all I could think about was a human being. All I could think about was what it would feel like. And just as a child at that point, only knowing what it feels like when I didn't want a spanking, or when I knew that I'd get home and I was about to be in trouble. And that kind of dread, but magnified 1,000 times, knowing that my execution was coming the next morning. And I remember being very, very grateful that the execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. the next morning. Because you see, it was summertime, and I knew very much I would be asleep when it happened. I never woke up before 10 a.m., and usually most days I would actually sleep till noon. And so I was grateful that I wouldn't actually be awake wondering what it was like to actually be executed. And yet the next morning I woke up, and as soon as I woke up I turned over and I looked at my clock, and it was 6:56 a.m. And I remember sitting there thinking and praying and trying as hard as I possibly could to just fall back to sleep in the 4 minutes before 7 a.m. came. However, of course, I knew as soon as I woke up that those attempts would be futile. So just as I had been grateful that I wouldn't have to do, I sat there and I imagined what it would be like to hear steps approaching. I imagined what it'd be like to see the guard opening my cell and telling me, it's time to go. I imagined in that moment what it would be like to just walk and walk, however many steps it was from your cell in death row to the death chamber. And as somebody with a fear of needles, I imagined what it would be like to be strapped down onto a gurney and to have somebody insert a needle into my body, wondering how many pricks did it take until the needle actually stuck. And then what it would be like and what I would be thinking in those final moments before the warden gave the signal. And what it would be like and the thoughts racing through my mind as I knew that people were watching out on the other side of glass. And knowing that there were people outside of the prison and people around the world, just as my dad had, taking delight and joy in a death. And in that moment, I couldn't help it. I just sat there and I laid in bed with silent tears streaming down my face. And then finally, about 7:15, I realized there's no way that I'm going to fall back to sleep. So I turned on the TV to see what was going on. And right as I turned on the TV, the news was breaking. At 7:14 a.m., Timothy McVeigh had been executed. And as I was saying, that was my first experience with the modern death penalty. And that was in 2001. And even though at that time I was still very much against the death penalty, and as a little girl I could not understand a heart that took joy and pleasure in another human being's death, I at least was able to reconcile the notion that as much as I was against it, I could understand the argument for the death penalty. I personally could not comprehend why we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong, but I could at least logically understand the eye for an eye argument. And so it was a policy that I never ever spoke out about, because like many of the Americans around the country, I believed that the United States had the greatest criminal justice system in the world. I believed with all of the appeals that happened that we only executed those that were truly guilty. And yet along the way in college I took a class and I learned that that's not the case at all. And in fact that was literally one of the most fatal thoughts that I had had, because our system is irreparably broken. We execute innocent people, I would argue, more often than we absolutely should. And I absolutely believe there's been innocent people executed in the last few years. But then I realized that, again, it's about the systemic approach. And so I realized that I wanted to be a part of the fight to end the death penalty. I knew that my empathy in that moment had sparked something inside of me that would allow me to start using my empathy to try to spread a message and to try and let individuals know that this was not an appropriate action. And so I decided I wanted to go to law school. And as I was preparing my final statement for my personal statement for law school, I wanted to go back to where it started for me, the very first execution. And I researched for the first time Timothy McVeigh's execution. And I remember I came across his final statement, and I got chills. And his final statement was a poem. It's a poem by William Ernest Henley called Invictus. And it goes like this. Out of the night, I'm sorry, normally I have it totally memorized, but not in this moment. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gates, nor charged with punishments the soul. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I got chills in that moment, and I held my necklace just as I'm doing now, because the necklace that I've worn that's always guided me had the exact same final words as his. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. And I just want to say a couple things. That was the first execution in modern history. There's only been 2 more since for the federal death penalty, and that happened in 2003. 3 people have been executed in the United States under the federal death penalty, and yet our president wanted to execute 3 of them in 1 week, and then 2 more in January. He wanted to more than double the executions that have happened. And I want you to think, if you can't empathize with the prisoners the same way that I did with Timothy McVeigh, think about the prison workers. Asking them to kill 3 people in 1 week is just absolutely insane. And it's not just about the federal executions too. We are executing state by state, and there are states right now that are very, very strongly ramping up their executions. So it's important to get involved and support organizations like Death Penalty Action. Abe and his organization has been monumental fighting the death penalty in Nashville, where Tennessee itself has doubled their rate of executions just in the last 3 years. And then I have to close with this because Nashville makes me think of another group that I'm also very proudly a part of. And there were 3 inmates scheduled for execution this week. The one for Monday and Wednesday were also granted stays on their own independent grounds. So I myself am beyond grateful that the first execution will not happen on December 13th, because anybody who is a part of this other group will know that just so happens to be Taylor Swift's birthday. And I am a diehard Swiftie, and I am beyond grateful that Taylor Swift's birthday will not be darkened for me because of the carrying out of the first federal execution since 2003. Thanks for listening to my story, and I hope that you'll get more involved in this movement and continue to support our work.
Thank you, Ashley. And now if we could please give our attention to Mr. Sylvester Edwards, the president of the Greater Terre Haute branch of the NAACP. I always question, is it Vigo County or Terre Haute? Anyway, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, freedom fighters, for being here today. As Sister Barbara said, I'm Sylvester Edwards, president of the Greater Terre Haute NAACP. A little information about the NAACP, a lot of people don't know about. This is our 110th year as freedom fighters. Now, it didn't start with just black people. In 1909, a white woman, along with the Jewish community and white philanthropists, got together to start the NAACP, along with another group of people, black, called the Niagara Movement. In this country, during that period of time, black people could not get together. They had to go all the way to Niagara, Canada, to talk about the state of the black community. And one of the members was W.E.B. Du Bois. He and the group and Mary Overland White and the Jewish community and the philanthropists started NAACP 110 years ago. It hasn't been that long before we had the first national president and CEO, it had always been ran by whites and the Jewish community, which was a good thing, because without that, we would not have the rules and laws, because NAACP had fought in the court system, the Supreme Court, to get a lot of the rights that we have today. And what most people don't realize, that we as black people are like the bird, the canary in the mines. When it happened to us, it's getting ready to happen to the next group above. And so we have been fighting for 110 years. This year, our motto is, when we fight, we win. This is what's happening right now. All the different groups have come together. Local, state, national, and international groups that came here to Terre, Haute. Now, we have had some negative things talked about Terre Haute in the past, the armpit of the Midwest. But now we are relegated to be the murder capital, state-sanctioned executions. Now, I was saying murder. There's a gentleman that I just met a little over a month ago. He was a chief executioner, and he found out that after the death of the person, it was stated cause of death. The cause of death and the statement legally, homicide. And he just realized that over 60 executions that he was a murderer. This is state-sanctioned murder. It is a terror. And as we have talked before about the things that we need to do in this country, we are the greatest power. Not only arms, but I'm talking about love, where people come together. And we are here today to make sure that these executions, this abolishment of this cruel act, whereas we was told about what we should do as brothers and sisters. For instance, not too long ago, about 20 years ago, my father went into a deep sleep, what most people call a coma. The doctors got together with the state social services, and as the elder of the children, with my grandmother and my aunts and his sisters, and my 3 sisters was there. And they asked me to be the one to unplug my father. That is the same thing as what's going on throughout this country, and the federal government doing the same. I said to them, when God decided to bring my father home, there's nothing that you can do, medicine, or all your devices and machine cannot keep him here until God decide for him to come home. You will take care of my father until that time. What they didn't understand is they asked me to execute my father, not knowing he's not perfect, and neither am I. We didn't have problems, as fathers and sons normally do. We have different opinion. But I could not see myself doing that. And as a gentleman that we just met about a month or so ago, we just call him Jerry.
Gibbons, Mr. Gibbons.
Okay. That he realized what they was doing is saying that I thought 20, 21 years ago that I was going to murder my father if I would have said yes. Now, how could they do something like that? They asked me. Well, they asked Jerry to do it, and he thought he was doing a good thing because it is the system. The system says, the government says, this is right. We know that it's not, and that's why we're here to take a stand. I can go on, but I guess I won't. So as I was saying, that NAACP is the canary in the mine, and how it got started in 1908 in Illinois, the capital city, which is Springfield, a so-called race riot where bad white people was going through black community, killing, maiming, destroying, setting fires. And a group of people came together, as we have today, to start an organization, start a movement, and push this movement to fruition. If we take forever for us to go ahead and change the laws of this country and the attitude of killing people, now we know that some of these people are guilty. They're not angels. But if they did not, the only one who should be able to take life is the same person who gives life, and that's God. And so have mercy on their soul. Have mercy on the soul of the people in the White House. For what they do, they may not know. But then again, stupidity is one thing, which means that you don't know. Excuse me, let me back that up. Dumb, that's when you don't know. Stupid is when you know, but you do it anyway. And I talked to Sister Barbara on certain things that what we got to do is stop this madness. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Sylvester. What a great colleague and collaborator himself personally, as well as the NAACP, makes just great partners to be working with. And now, did I say, by the way, that these are my colleagues from the Interfaith Council of the Wabash Valley? I'm not sure if I mentioned that out loud, but especially, it's just really nice that throughout the crowd, there are several of us in the crowd here tonight. But our next person is Terre, who comes to us from the Interfaith Council of the Wabash Valley. Terre?
At this time, I'd like to invite my fellow IFC members to join me up here. We are a diverse group, but we stand in solidarity against capital punishment, against the death penalty. I'd also like to take just a minute to express our heartfelt sympathy to the victims of violent crime and to their families. There are no words that are adequate. We stand with you in your pain and pray for you to feel God's continued presence. I'd like to read the IFC's resolution opposing the death penalty. Whereas the Interfaith Council of the Wabash Valley believes the death penalty is cruel and inhumane and violates the constitutional ban against cruel and unusual punishment, as well as the guarantees of law and equal protection under the law. Moreover, it is an intolerable denial of civil liberties and is inconsistent with the fundamental values of our democratic system. Whereas, the primary message conveyed by an execution is one of brutality and violence. The death penalty is not used fairly, has failed to make society safer, and undermines any possible alternative moral message. Whereas, the death penalty is uncivilized in theory and often unfair and inequitable in practice, and is disproportionately applied against the most vulnerable in society, including the poor, ethnic and religious minorities, as well as people with mental disorders. Whereas, justice systems can be flawed with the risk of executing an innocent person ever present. When the death penalty is carried out, it is final. Mistakes made cannot be unmade. Innocent persons may be released from prison for a crime they did not commit, but an execution can never be reversed. Whereas, even though there is eye for an eye justice referenced in all Abrahamic religions, so is prohibiting murder. Execution is murder, even if it is state-sanctioned. In addition, mercy, compassion, and forgiveness are fundamental parts and are at the very spirit of all major world religions. Therefore, Be it resolved that the IFC condemns the use of the death penalty, as it inherently violates the constitutional ban against cruel and unusual punishment and the guarantees of law and of equal protection under the law. Therefore, be it resolved that we, of many faiths who belong to the Interfaith Council of the Wabash Valley, call on the United States to join other Western countries to ban, once and for all, the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for everyone who came forward. It is an amazingly diverse group, this Interfaith Council. And Arthur might not sit down since you're coming up next. And finally, from this, what we are calling the local panel, the Hoosier panel, we're going to hear from Dr. Arthur Feinsod. He is the president of the Interfaith Council and has a lot of other titles that he bears, but that's why he's here tonight. Arthur?
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Thank you. Thank you. I address these remarks not only to Attorney General Barr, who reinstated the death penalty for federal crimes, but also to those in the 29 states, including Indiana, who have the power to terminate human life via the death penalty. I urge you to consider words offered by us of many faiths here in the Wabash Valley, we of the Interfaith Council. Mahatma Gandhi once said, quote, "If a man reaches the heart of his own religion, he has reached the heart of others too," unquote. This idea prompted me to gather words and stories from individuals of great conscience of varied religious traditions, people who devoted their lives, both in word and deed, to getting to the heart of their own respective religions, to see if the heart they arrived at can relate to the death penalty issue, which of course constitutes a challenging test for the values of every major world religion and their leaders. The death penalty is a state-sanctioned act of violence perpetuated in retribution and punishment, usually against one accused of murder. And religious figures of great conscience opposing violence of any kind will always invariably oppose the death penalty. There is no greater spokesman in modern times for absolute nonviolence than Mahatma Gandhi, who comes to this subject from a Hindu perspective. Gandhi famously spent his years in South Africa, then in India, promoting the philosophy of ahimsa, or nonviolence, which of course includes opposition to the death penalty. These are his own words from a letter written in 1916, quote, "By birth I am a follower of Vishnu, and was taught ahimsa in my childhood. In its negative form, ahimsa means not injuring any living being, whether by body or mind. I may not therefore hurt the person of any wrongdoer or bear any ill will to him, and so cause him mental suffering." He later went on to say, "There are many causes I would die for. There's not a single cause I would kill for," unquote. For a Protestant voice, I draw on the words from Gandhi's most famous American follower, Martin Luther King Jr. Besides being the leading voice for the civil rights movement, King studied Gandhi seriously, traveling to India as a young man to study Gandhi's philosophy of ahimsa years after Gandhi's assassination. When Dr. King was asked in 1957, quote, "Do you think God approves the death penalty for crimes like rape and murder?" unquote, King responded, "I do not think that God approves the death penalty for any crime, rape and murder included. Capital punishment is against the better judgment of modern criminology and above all against the highest expression of love in the nature of God," unquote. In his sermon, Loving Your Enemies, Dr. King preached a philosophy that came right from the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, right from Jesus' challenge to all of us to love our enemies. His words still resonate today, quote, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction." Unquote. In addition to Gandhi, King was deeply influenced by the writings of the great modern Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, even quoting from Buber's I and Thou in King's most memorable piece of writing, A Letter from Birmingham Jail. Turning philosophy into action in 1961, Buber sought to halt the execution of one of the Jews' most notorious enemies, Adolf Eichmann, who was personally responsible for the deaths of thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust, and now had been transferred from Argentina to Israel to face the death penalty there. Despite condemnation from many of his fellow Jews, Buber visited Israeli President David Ben-Gurion to try to get a stay of execution for Eichmann based on the Hebrew Bible's "Thou shalt not kill," arguing that this principle applied to the state just as much as it did to the individual. Later, Buber wrote, quote, "What the Torah teaches us is this: none but God can command us to destroy a man," unquote. And later, Buber said, "The death sentence has not diminished crime. On the contrary, killing awakens killing," unquote. From a Buddhist perspective, the 14th and present Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, opposes the death penalty on the grounds it cuts short the opportunity to change. Back in the 1990s, the Dalai Lama said the following, quote, "The death penalty is very clearly a form of revenge. It is an especially severe form of punishment because it's so final. The human life is ended and the executed person is deprived of the opportunity to change, to restore the harm done or compensate for it. Before advocating execution, we should consider whether criminals are intrinsically negative and harmful people, or whether they will remain perpetually in the same state of mind in which they committed their crime. The answer, I believe, is definitely not. However horrible the act they committed, I believe everyone has the potential to improve and correct themselves. Therefore, I'm optimistic that it remains possible to deter criminal activity and prevent such harmful consequences of such acts in society without having to resort to the death penalty," unquote. Probably the most famous advocate of nonviolence among modern Muslims was Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a close friend of Gandhi's, who marched shoulder to shoulder with him many times for the cause of India's freedom from Great Britain, as well as in their unsuccessful attempt to keep India and Pakistan as one country. Declaring, quote, "Nonviolence is love and stirs courage in people," Khan went on to say, "The Holy Prophet Muhammad came into this world and taught us that a Muslim is a man who never hurts anyone by word or deed, but who works for the benefit and happiness of God's creatures. Belief in God is to love one's fellow men," unquote. And as I stand here at St. Ben's, a magnificent Catholic church, I'd like to end with a Catholic voice, the voice of Mother Teresa. This account is by Father John Deere, who in 1990 frantically was trying to stop an execution in California and called on Mother Teresa to come to his aid. This is his story in his own words. "Nervous, I dialed the long number. Halfway around the world, Mother Teresa picked up the phone in her office. 'Hello,' she said in a heavy, unmistakable Albanian Indian accent. I introduced myself, told her the situation, asked if she'd be willing to help. 'What exactly did Robert Harris do?' she asked. I told her, then proposed that she speak with the governor of California, George Dugmagian, by phone in the next few days before the execution and ask for clemency. 'Yes, I will,' she said, 'and I will ask all the sisters at the Mother House here in Calcutta to pray for the governor.' She spoke of her visit a few years earlier to San Quentin's death row. On the way out that day, she told me, she told the guard, quote, "What you do to them, you do to God." On Monday evening, March 26, 1990, Mother Teresa spoke briefly with the governor. I called her back immediately to find out what happened. "Did you speak with the governor?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "He started talking about how he had to do this, that this was the law." "Well, what did you say?" I asked. And Mother Teresa's response, "I just said, do what Jesus would do." No arguments, no statistics, no invocation of sin or immorality or injustice, no lecture, no angry denunciation, just do what Jesus would do in your shoes. She cut right to the heart of the matter. "That's all I said," Mother Teresa continued. "He talked again how it was in the state's hands, so I just repeated to him, do what Jesus would do if he were in your position." So taking my cue from Mother Teresa, I ask you, Attorney General Barr, and all others with the final say over life and death via the death penalty, wherever you are in all those 29 states, I ask, what would Jesus do if he were in your shoes? And I ask the same question because I can ask the same way to listen to the individuals of deep conscience of different religions around the world. What would the Dalai Lama do? Or Martin Luther King Jr. do? Or Martin Buber do? Or Ghaffar Khan do? Or Mahatma Gandhi do? Or Mother Teresa do? What would all these individuals do? People who reached the heart of their own particular religion and found there the same exact answer. And it was not vengeful punishment, which comes from hate, but rather compassion, mercy, forgiveness, which come from love. We of the IFC believe that if you listen to those who delved into human conscience deepest, you'll hear the same word they heard, a word that is incompatible with the idea and the reality of the death penalty, and that word is love.